Alberto Giacometti is recognized as one of the small group of modern masters who dominated art during much of the 20th century. Alberto Giacometti, the elder son of the painter Giovanni Giacometti and Annetta Giacometti Stampa, was born on October 10, 1901, in Borgo Novo, near Stampa, in the Bregaglia Valley in southeastern Swiss Alps. He had 3 younger siblings, 2 brothers, Diego and Bruno, and a sister named Ottilia. The air of closeness and danger in this southern valley made a deep impression on Alberto's imagination. Alberto's grandfather built the Hotel Pise Douane on the road through the pass, and in 1906 his son Giovanni moved with his growing family into a house diagonally opposite the hotel. Alberto's intense nature and extraordinary gift were recognized early on by his parents. His relationship to his mother, Annetta, a strong, encouraging, yet exacting personality, was unusually close and remained so into her old age. His father, too, was an important figure in Alberto's artistic development. As a child, Alberto was happiest when he was working with his father in the studio, so his early training occurred naturally. In the fall of 1919, Alberto begins studying art at the École des Beaux-Arts and École des Arts Industriels in Geneva. In January 1922, he moves to Paris and enrolls in a life drawing class and sculpture class at the Académie de la Grande Chaumière, which he continued to attend until 1927. Between 1942 and 1945, Alberto lived and worked in Geneva and met his future wife, Annette Arms, in the Brasserie Centrale. After the war, Giacometti returns home to his atelier in Paris and resumes his work there. Annette follows him a year later, and they are married on July 19, 1949, at the registry office in the 14th arrondissement. In October 1962, he is diagnosed with stomach cancer and undergoes surgery a few months later in Paris at the Rémy de Gourmont Clinic. 3 years later, at the urging of Annette, Giacometti checks himself into a hospital for exhaustion and heart and circulatory problems, but his condition worsens just before Christmas 1965. On January 10, 1966, he is diagnosed with pericarditis and dies of complications the next day. He was buried in a cemetery in Borgo Novo, where he was born. Self-Portraits, 1918. In this double portrait drawing of his mother and himself, the 17-year-old Alberto was already secure in his use of form. The 2 portraits, in 3/4 view, reflect Alberto's engagement with the great tradition of European art, which he had studied with intense concentration and copied from books. The 2 frontal views, on the other hand, recall the consistently stylized art of Ferdinand Hodler, a family friend who had recently died. Self-Portrait, 1921. Here, Alberto drew together what he had learned from his father, his sure touch with the paintbrush, and rich, densely intertwined, bright tonal values. But a very different artistic temperament manifests itself in the highly charged, analytical approach, as the composition bows to the rectangular shape of the picture. And we see a motif whose metaphorical content was to spur the artist on throughout his life, kneeling on one knee, with his gaze turned toward the viewer. Mountain at Stampa, 1923. 3 Nudes, 1923-24. Self-Portrait, 1923-24. The Skull, 1923. Self-portrait, 1923. Self-portrait, 1925. Torso, 1925. Giacometti made his debut in the Salon d'Automne with Torso. The three elements of Torso's form are recognizable as a human body and legs, but they are altered in the direction of geometric clarity. Its taut forms and upward-striving contrapposto radiate an organic vitality that derives from years of life drawing. Here, central concerns of Giacometti's sculpture, such as the act of seeing and the presence of voids, emerge for the first time. Studio with Sculptor's Turntable, 1931. Still Life with Gudea Head, 1927. Cubist Composition, Man, 1926-27. Figures, 1926-27. Here, the static isolation of the elements prevails. Any exchange between them is, if anything, symbolically indicated by a system of tubes. Composition, Reclining, Couple, 1927. Here, Giacometti made a breakthrough by dissolving the solid plastic form and allowing space to penetrate it. While it still has an almost mechanical, superficial feel, it is the first work to realize an integrated dynamic. The form of the piece may well be indebted to Raymond Duchamp-Villon's great sculpture, The Horse, of 1914, while the influence of Lipschitz is especially evident in other of its aspects. Spoon Woman, 1926-27. Inspired by the human-shaped spoons used by the Dan tribe in Africa, the Spoon Woman possesses a near magical, evocative power, almost daunting the viewer with its seemingly ineluctable presence. The mighty spoon shape, reminiscent of primitive fertility idols, curves half toward the viewer and partly away. A bewildering tension is created as the leg pedestal slips toward the ground, while the crystalline shapes of waist, breast, and moon-like one-eyed head take flight upward, thus emphasizing its floating quality. The Couple, 1926. Giacometti's striving for a symbolic representation of reality is evident in this early sculpture, where, isolated and raised up on individual pedestals, two figures appear as symbols of their gender. The woman's open form is indicated by the frame, while the overall shape recalls the self-portrait of 1925. The details, applied or incised signs, may be read as elements of the face or of the whole body, and thus, like the chiasmic transposition of the sexual features of one onto the eyes of the other, indicate the other dimensions of the figure's sexuality. This pair of figures, utterly static, yet with a latent dynamism in their challenging and complementary plasticity, introduced the dialogue of the sexes that Giacometti depicts in many of his subsequent sculptures. Dancers, 1927. Head, 1926. Small Crouching Man, 1926, is perhaps the most idiosyncratic of the small male figures that Giacometti made between 1925 and 1930. Its more realistic appearance is distinctly different from the others, and it is obviously related more to the environment of Stampa than to the avant-garde circles of Paris. In order to achieve a flatness similar to that of his small Paris figures, square rather than reaching upward, Giacometti had bent the limbs of this figure into a crouching form. The Artist's Mother, 1927. In The Artist's Mother, Giacometti pursued the same questions, setting out to create a sculpture that would appear to be fully three-dimensional and could be viewed from all sides, and which appears, at the same time, to have been stripped of its mass, thus completing what he had attempted, perhaps only playfully, in the small, crouching man. The Artist's Father, 1927. The Artist's Father, seen here in bronze, displays the original addictive technique of clay sculpture. The build-up and accumulation of material also serve to give character to details, such as the strands of hair. The Artist's Father, 2, 1927. In the marble head of Giovanni, the medium seems entirely in the service of the basic form, and yet the piece bears a striking likeness to its subject, even without details. It is only in certain lights that features appear on the front surface of the head in most delicate relief, as though gleaming from within the crystalline stone, but it is the haptic plastic aspect that dominates. The Artist's Father, flat and engraved, 1927. The purely optical, painterly counterpart of the marble head is to be found in this bronze sculpture. Here, in the boldest of the series, the front half of the head is cut away flat, parallel to the line of the face, and the individual features are scratched in as though in a drawing. At the time, Giacometti continued work in realistic idioms alongside his Cubist-influenced and ethnographic forms, creating a degree of mutually enriching tension between different artistic possibilities. The Artist's Father, 1932. Man, Apollo, 1929. Woman, 1928-29. Gazing Head, 1928. With Gazing Head, Giacometti succeeded in making an elusive, non-corporeal structure. As plain and obvious as it is bewildering, this work is the completely innovative starting point for future developments. The flattened face of the head of his father and the foreshortened head of his mother are here carried to an extreme, resulting in a sequence of flat figures and bodily parts. If the viewer wants to look into its eyes, the gazing head switches to a profile view. It looks, but allows no one to look it in the eye. Reclining Woman, 1929. Reclining Woman Who Dreams, 1929. Here, the artist laid a weightless, planar plastic form down horizontally. The cosmic dimension resonates here, when the work is read as a dream landscape with a heavenly body above the waves. Man and Woman, 1929. Three Figures Outdoors, 1929. L'heure des traces, 1930. Cage, 1930. Suspended Ball, 1930. Vide Poche, 1930. Giacometti demonstrated here, with programmatic clarity, the concept of the Surrealists, that works of art should be found items from the subconscious that are lifted into everyday reality. In place of the pedestal, there is an everyday object, a little bowl into which one empties the contents of one's pockets. This object does not separate the spheres of art and ordinary life, but rather inextricably binds one to the other. What comes out of the pockets now, two shrunken offshoots of the plaque sculptures, does not deny their deeply hidden origins. They no longer stand, they are lying in the cavity, evoking the notion of a swinging movement which also threatens to unbalance the everyday object. Family Portrait, 1930. The Disagreeable Object to be Thrown Away, 1931. This sculpture deforms the visionary early work of the gazing head into something low, crooked, and directionless, with obscene, aggressive protuberances. One could certainly talk of fetishes here in the original sense of something made which is imbued with sinister psychic forces, yet this vulgarity is embodied in a form that may be disturbingly incomprehensible and, as such, formless, but nevertheless sculpturally perfect. Disagreeable object, 1931. Model for a square, 1930-31. Model for a square was perhaps the first idea on the subject of models of squares. There is then a certain appropriateness about the interpretation of this work as a Garden of Eden with the tree of knowledge and the serpent. Project for a passageway, 1930. Figure in a garden, 1930-32. Significantly, the only project to be realized full-size, Figure in a Garden, changed considerably in the process. An ensemble of figures turned into a single statue-like figure with very different relationship to the viewer. No longer symbolic, but with an immediate physical appeal, like conventional sculptures of human figures. Circuit, 1931. Man, Woman, Child, 1931. Landscape, Reclining Head, 1932. Here, Giacometti entertained the idea of equating a reclining figure with a landscape. The switch from head to landscape is an old metaphor for the correspondence between microcosm and macrocosm. As can be noted, one eye bulges markedly, emphasizing the active nature of the gaze fixed on the viewer. Caress, Despite Hands, 1932. The rounded side is generally interpreted as a pregnant stomach, over which a man's hands are incised, detracting attention from the abstract beauty of the object. The Palace at 4 a.m., 1932. According to the artist, the palace reflects a past time when he and a woman attempted obsessively to build a palace out of matchsticks. Giacometti attributes the spinal column to the woman. The standing figure to the left he identified as his mother, as she appeared to him as a child, and the artist saw himself in the object in the unfinished or ruined tower. Everything seems non-corporeal, transparent, individual, and at the same time general. The timeless temple facade with 3 doors, and the unapproachable, self-contained figure of the mother, opposite her Giacometti's lover at the mercy of time and thus of death, and the fragile glass walkway that links the 2 spheres and crosses over the symbol of masculinity, itself half eye, half sexual organ, ambiguously rising or falling. The Studio, 1932. Giacometti's studio was recorded in numerous drawings, but nowhere does it appear so clearly with such metaphysical lucidity as in these 2 drawings of 1932. At the left is the figure of a slender walking woman without head and arms, and with a shallow triangular indentation in the stomach area, much as the finished sculpture of Walking Woman appears. My Studio, 1932. Here, drawn with crystalline precision, the palace at 4 a.m. stands in the center of the room, almost like a small model of the studio space itself, with several of his works grouped around it. The recumbent woman of the Project for a Passageway is upright against the wall, and enlarged individual elements from the Model for a Square can also be seen. Woman with Her Throat Cut, 1932. As puzzling as the combination of the leaf-like, jagged shell shape and its thinly extending insect limbs may be, it is compelling in the impression it gives of an animated being, terrifying either as a giant spider with energy-laden extremities or as a woman with her throat cut, writhing in death throes. It was the artist's wish that the sculpture should lie on the floor without a pedestal, not separated from the territory of the viewer. No More Play, 1932. The central section of this piece alludes to a field of graves. This work is focused in real terms as sections of a board game or mechanical constructions in which directly legible figurative elements are inescapably exposed to punitive forces. Point to the Eye, 1932. An image of combat on a Mexican ritual site with a channel for sacrificial blood. The victim of the spike aiming at the eye appears to be death itself, always the victor in the dance of life. Caught Hand, 1932. Here, a mechanical crank invites the viewer to turn it, and the imagined result of the action evokes both the sadistic and the masochistic. The hand caught in the bars of the mechanism is reminiscent of the prostheses or shop window mannequins, favored fetishes of the Surrealists with their cult of compulsions and phobias concerning physical contact. Flower in Danger, 1933. Hands Holding the Void, Invisible Object, 1934. Hands Holding the Void is a monument to Giacometti's father, the heraldic large woman who holds the deceased soul, the Egyptian Ka. One can observe a horizontal slit-like opening of the pedestal, defining it as a grave. On a high, coffin-like base, a female figure walks toward the viewer with its arms raised. At the same time, the dark interior of the grave is visible through the pedestal's slit. The dark lower void, as opposed to the upper void held in the figure's hands. The soul, or Ka, can communicate through both spheres, its presence indicated by the hieroglyph of the soul bird, or death bird, on the side of the throne. Walking Woman, 1932-34. A flattened, slimmed-down, modernized Egyptian figure, Walking Woman stands with the left foot extended slightly forward. Beveling the base adds to the elusive, vision-like quality of the figure. Figure, 1935. Head, Skull, 1934. The ambivalence between death and life is very evident in this sculpture. The dead side seems much stronger and livelier than the other, smooth, abstract side. The different treatment of the two sides of the head, a meaning that had to be reconstructed by a considered analysis of the forms. Cube, Nocturnal Pavilion, 1934. Self-Portrait, 1935. This drawn self-portrait bears witness to his efforts to convey animated life through the use of a combination of Cubist and Egyptian-derived elements. The Artist's Mother, 1937. This painting recalls the only earlier painting of similar intensity, the Self-Portrait of 1923. It has the same monumentalization of the figure and concentration in the face. But instead of a multifaceted application of color, dark and light lines build up the forms. A framework of energy lines compellingly evoke reality, yet have no mass. Apple on a Sideboard, 1937. Apple on the Sideboard, 1937. Here, Giacometti was concentrating on a single apple placed at the exact center of his field of vision. He expressed the decreasing exactitude toward the edges of that field in the summary execution of the painting. As though conducting a phenomenological exploration, Giacometti did not naively seek to transfer reality directly onto the canvas, but to realize the picture of reality held within his inner perception. Pope Innocent X, after Velázquez, circa 1936, dated 1942. His copy, Pope Innocent X, after Velázquez, rendered in a more direct drawing style, buoyed up by a rhythmic microstructure, reflects characteristics of the Master of X in a form that is considerably more direct. Head Studies, 1937. Study from a Head of Didefre, 1937. Study from an Egyptian Relief, 1937. Three Studies of Gudea Head, 1937. Vases and Flowers, 1938. The Chiffonnier, 1941. Interior, 1942. Automatic Drawing, 1943. Small Bust on a Double Pedestal, 1940-45. Small Figure on a Pedestal, 1940-45. Small Figure on a Pedestal, 1940-45. While the perceived distance of viewer to figure in a painting can be fixed by the painted illusion of space, sculpture does not offer this possibility. Making even smaller figures, Giacometti tried to impart the lived experience of distance. In order to distinguish his tiny figures from miniature close-ups, he retained their sketchy forms and placed them on oversized pedestals, thereby defining the relationship of motif and field of vision, as in a picture frame. Nude, 1942-43. Woman with Chariot, 1942-43. Giacometti constructed this sculpture not as he normally did in clay over a wire armature, but with plaster applied directly to a straw core. Thus, this plainly formed body has something of the amorphous quality of a rag doll. Elongated, rounded in its cross-sections, the individual shapes as uniform as those of a young child. Volume and surface, accordingly, seem to be floating, no longer sustained by basic geometric forms or permeated with vital organic impulse. Studio Interior, 1940. Three Portraits of Pierre Loeb, 1946. Decisive progress is evident in his draftsmanship. While he was still in Switzerland, the rigid forms of the late 1930s were already starting to loosen somewhat, and the space around them was acquiring a certain transparency. In 1946, this process accelerated noticeably, as can be witnessed from the following studies. Apples, 1946. Jean-Paul Sartre, 1946. Homage to Balzac, 1946. The Artist's Mother, 1946. Head of Diego, 1947. Head on a Rod, 1947. The viewer is immediately assailed by the presence of an impaled head that seems alarmingly alive. This mingling of the lifelike and the rigid had a particular meaning for Giacometti. By turning the head of his model into an enduring, immutable, though animated form, he in effect petrified the life of it. The Nose, 1947. The nose shifts the opposed elements presented in the surrealist sculpture to include the viewer, whose gaze, confronted by the thrusting, aggressive blade of the nose, is met by that of death, breaking out of its sphere. The Leg, 1958. The leg has a severed and mutilated aspect, which probably found its source in an earlier accident, where the artist was hit by a car and broke his foot. Giacometti sought to raise what was low. A foot is lifted out of the dust and placed on a pedestal, and a leg becomes memorial. The Hand, 1947. The mannequin's hand, used to decorate fashion shop windows, has become admonitorially memorial, a severed and eerie mutilated limb. Figures in an Interior, 1946. If Giacometti's figures insist on the amorphous materiality of their being, their postures belong to the highest reaches of rhetoric. Their stance first emerged in drawings, in notes made in the street or sketches of groups of figures reduced to bundles of lines. Standing Woman, 1947. This frontal female figure rises from the ground like a vision and is fixed to the paper with almost convulsive intensity. Standing Woman, 1946. Femme Léonie, 1947. Tall Figure, 1947. Standing Woman, 1948. Standing Woman, 1948. Man Walking in the Rain, 1948. Walking Man, 1947. Giacometti's self-image as an artist always searching, striving to move forward, is here exemplified. The pace of Walking Man, the first large figure of its kind, is closer to the solemnity of Egyptian statues than to the dramatic striding of Rodin's own Walking Man. The artist's figure moves forward tentatively, as though making a first-ever attempt at walking. City Square, 1948. The Cage, Woman and Head, Detail, 1950. This image can be understood as a representation of a dialogue, in the sense that the head, growing out of the block, self-awareness, assimilates and integrates with the image of impinging perceived reality, the statuette, within the realm of the imagination, the bars of the cage. Four Women on a Base, 1950. Four Figurines on a Stand, 1950. In this work, the outward gaze beholds four female figures appearing as small shapes in the distance, on a stand mimicking the gleaming, recessive orthogonals of a wood floor. The Forest, 1950. The Chariot, 1950. The process of perception, the tension between the self-revealing approach and the elusive retreat of an ultimately unfathomable other, is perfectly expressed in visual terms through the metaphor of the chariot. Its base, at once practical and floating, marks a diversion between the sphere of the figure and that of the viewer. Diego, 1948. In this drawing, Giacometti structured the pictorial field with rectangles of the kind he regularly used in drawings as rudimentary indications of space and compositional elements. Here, however, they are used to form a compact lattice system with the purpose to create a picture surface composed, on the one hand, of a dense but transparent net of fine white and black lines defining the subject, and, on the other hand, of areas of earthy colors applied with a broad brush, fluently, and almost like a glaze. The Studio, 1951. The Studio with Sculptures, 1953-56. Interior, 1949. The Studio, Still Life, 1950. Annette with Chariot, 1950. The Artist's Mother, 1950. Annette at Stampa, 1950. Annette, 1951. The Artist's Mother, 1951. Apples in the Studio, 1953. Study of the Apples, 1952. Still Life, 3 Apples, 1959. Sideboard at Stampa, 1955. Interior with Table, 1959. Vase of Flowers, 1952. A Vase of Zinnias, 1959. Man Pointing, 1947. This was originally intended to have a companion piece, but the other figure was never definitely realized. Had it come into being, the viewer would have been faced with a closed dialogue between two figures, whereas the artist wanted above all to create an immediate link between viewer and figure. Man Falling, 1950. This sculpture, one of his slenderest, most fragile figures, seems about to topple from its small, cylindrical pedestal. Yet it holds its position by throwing the head back ecstatically. Man Falling is a human being in precisely the extreme situation in which his transcendental destiny becomes apparent. Seated Woman, 1950. Figure in a box between two boxes which are houses, 1950. A white female figure in a glass box also inevitably recalls Snow White in her glass coffin, one of the artist's earliest obsessions. This work has been interpreted as depicting a person caught on the pathway of life, walking from her mother's womb to her grave. Alternatively, an anecdotal interpretation is that of Annette between Paris and Stampa. Dog, 1951. The Masterless Dog is another piece that lends itself to existential interpretation. As such, however, it can be seen as an image of a miserable life. It can also be a symbol of autonomous self-fulfillment. The Street, 1952. The street, which shows a street rapidly receding into the distance, just as the artist saw it when he left his studio. It shows by its method of depicting the essentials of this specific scene that this street is intended to stand for the prototype of the genre, the ultimate street. The motif is surrounded by a distinct internal frame, effectively emphasized by its dark color and double line. Mountain at Stampa, 1955. Tree at Stampa, 1955. The Garden at Stampa, 1954. The motif that first gripped him in 1952 and that stood at the center of his interest in landscape until the late 1950s was the orchard outside his father's studio, as in The Garden at Stampa. It was almost a part of the interior. He only needed to open the window or draw the curtains back to look straight into the crowns of trees, the crooked telegraph pole, the slope of the hills, his grandparents' hotel to the right, animal sheds, and other outbuildings to the left. The frames recede in 5 progressive stages, until finally the atmospheric light floods over even the furthest line. Energy initially concentrated in the center of this large canvas radiates outward increasingly strongly. Landscape, Maloja, 1953. This spectral shows the view from the family's summer house past the flat threshold of the pass to the mountains above Stampa. Landscape at Stampa, 1952. This canvas depicts the artist's home, appearing at the right in the picture. The viewer's gaze travels from the garden of his grandparents' house up the valley towards Maloja. Landscape, 1957. Maloja, view toward Marnia, 1957. Bust of Diego, 1950. Large head of Diego, 1954. On the one hand, the artist brings out by means of sharp differentiation the particular capacity of the head to display two different faces, which are ultimately irreconcilable in their psychological expressivity. By contrast, a very carefully differentiated flattening serves to animate the front view of the face. Death, often associated with the profile in Giacometti's art, is here implied in the half-open mouth and the sharp nose. Diego in a Sweater, 1953. Through the relation of the head to the body and distortion of widths and depths, Giacometti found the means to activate specific modes of perception. This principle is at its most succinct in this sculpture, where, due to the retreat and diminution of the head, all the energy is concentrated in this intense core which dominates everything around it. The contrast of a tiny head and massive pedestal developed in the miniature sculptures created a tension that takes on an exponentially heightened power. Diego in a Cloak, 1954. Bust of Diego, 1954. Diego in a Plaid Shirt, 1954. The image, with its complex posture and meticulously painted face, uniquely reveals the character of Giacometti's brother, the artist's model, assistant, and crucial support throughout his life. Jean Genet, 1954-55. Portrait of Jean Genet, 1954-55. This portrait is styled after an Egyptian figure of a seated writer in the Louvre, Paris. The painting in its entirety conveys a strong sense of internal flux, while the head seems to float alone, turned in on itself. Portrait of G. David Thompson, 1957. Here, an aggressive reduction of proportions, from the knees to the head, produces an optically disturbing pull into the depths and causes the figure to appear close and distant at one and the same time. Thompson is portrayed as a man of obvious will and ego, whose person extends threateningly forward from his tiny, densely core-like head to his hands, grasping his thighs like mighty claws. Portrait of David Sylvester, 1960. Jean Genet, 1954. Annette, 1954. Igor Stravinsky, 1957. Henri Matisse, 1954. Giacometti was commissioned to design a medallion with the head of Henri Matisse, for which he made numerous life studies, including this one of the painter who died a few months later in Nice. James Lord, 1954. Eberhard W. Kornfeld, 1959. Silvio Bertaux, 1959. Nude, After Nature, 1954. Woman of Venice 2, 1956. Woman of Venice 8, 1956. Woman of Venice 5, 1956. The women of Venice mark the halfway point in Giacometti's mature work. They bring together the different characteristics of his figures. The extremely small, distant heads and the innovatively sloping pedestals from which the oversized feet grow still make them seem like revelatory, illusionistic visions. Their marked three-dimensionality heightens the erotic quality of the breasts and pelvis, whose curves are accentuated by the hands on either side of it. At the same time, the extreme plasticity brings out the morbid, decaying nature of the amorphously fissured surfaces. The tension in the mingling of goddess and concubine, of Egyptian cult image and decomposing corpse, is seen nowhere as vividly as in this group, in which now one, now another aspect moves into focus. Diego, 1956. The gray mist, licking like a flame around the subject, reads as an almost desperate blow for freedom from the space that refuses to be reconciled with the figure. Yanehara, 1956. In this painting, the perspectival indicators on the background have largely disappeared. Significantly, the trapezoid on the right reads rather as a brace supporting the figure within the rectangle of the picture. All that remain of the pale yellowish and grayish floating surfaces is a wholly indefinable spatial mist or color plane, like an internal frame. Portrait of Isaku Yanehara, 1959. Isaku Yanehara, 1961. Still Life with Bottles, 1958. Tall Seated Nude, 1957. This large nude of Annette conveys a somber and gray mood. Yet the more securely rendered figure detached itself somewhat from the misty space and seems to indicate a way out of the crisis. Instead of sinking into the depths, the figure seems to be floating forward, an effect that is reinforced by the narrow vertical format and the dynamic opening of the internal frame at the top, and especially below. Ica, 1959. The vigorous coloration of Ica was inspired by the charm of Giacometti's tailor's 15-year-old daughter. She sat for the painting close to a window, and only during the day. Annette in the Studio, 1961. Four Figures and a Head, 1960. Monumental Head, 1960. Walking Man 2, 1960. Tall Woman 2, 1960. Giacometti proposed a group of larger-than-life-size sculptures, a standing woman, walking man, and a head on a pedestal, representing the three major themes that almost exclusively occupied him in his mature sculptural work. He made tiny models and started in his cramped studio to work on a number of variants for the large figures. Annette, 1959. Annette, 1954. Annette appears in the immediate foreground as a three-quarter-length nude with a sensually rounded body, an image unlike any encountered elsewhere in Giacometti's work. The mutual influence of the different genres of drawing, painting, and sculpture always revolves around issues of seeing, perceiving, and capturing reality. Giacometti's basic phenomenological aim was simply to show the process of seeing. The themes of Giacometti's work ranged most widely in his drawings and similar graphic works. In the paintings, he portrayed familiar landscapes and still lifes, as well as people he knew, but the sculptures were restricted to the head, the standing woman, and the walking man. Similarly, the range of sitters became increasingly narrow. There are only a few moments when the same motif is treated in all three genres. The most intense interchange of this kind may perhaps be seen in the portraits of Annette. Here, Giacometti searched in all mediums for a new, more rigorous evocation of the ephemeral living model. Annette, 1960. Annette 4, 1962. Annette 5, 1962. Annette 4, 1962. Annette 8, 1962. Caroline, 1962. Caroline 2, 1962. The radiance of the figure's personality fills the whole picture. Toward the outside edges of the picture, bare canvas and trails of color clearly made of binding agent and pigment confirmed the reified facture of the painting. Lost hints of an internal frame and oscillating veils of color surround the head and open up a space around the figure. The body, treated in a nearly abstract expressionist manner, activates the viewer's attention on a psychic level by its posture and on a visual level by its facture. Inexorably, the torso leads the viewer to the head, which curves toward the viewer with sculptural force. Here it would seem that all the evocative, illusionistic power of realistic painting as Giacometti knew it has imploded. Caroline, 1962. Self-Portrait, 1960. The Mother, Reading, Frontal View, 1963. The Mother, Reading, in Profile, 1963. Interior at Stampa, 1959. Ceiling Lamp, 1963. The Studio at Stampa, 1964. Hotel Room 3, 1963. Large Black Head, 1961. Large Nude, 1962. Woman and Head, 1965. New York Bust 1, 1965. Lothar 2, 1965. Lothar 3, 1965. The bust of Lothar, with its worn, eroded shoulders, locked into an amorphousness, suggests theories of base materialism and the ineluctability of the earthbound. Yet the head on those shoulders possesses a stubborn radiance seldom seen in Giacometti's work. The gaze is directed higher, recalling a seated Egyptian figure. The whole is elevated into the sublime, where time ceases to exist, and the paradoxes of death and life, density of form and absence of form, are subsumed in the sheer crystalline view of the aesthetic presence.